The comic books have a responsibility to tell a deeper, more meaningful story and narrative than the rest of mainstream is ready to tell. It's hard to think of a commercially driven product as being socially responsible for those things, but it is true that comics have often led the conversation on a lot of tougher topics. Let's get into that. Hey there, this is Perch. And, there's an interesting dialogue, and like many things, the answer is somewhere in the middle. But there's this conversation that happens from time to time that basically goes like this. Comic books, by nature of kind of their storytelling reach and their ability to get deeper into certain topics, can often lead the way in more alternative topics that maybe the mainstream isn't quite ready for yet. Topics around looking at our society through a particular lens, or maybe being more friendly toward LGBTQ uh, issues and concerns, maybe the environment, maybe different forms of politics, maybe different forms of substance abuse or other things. Over the years, there's been this dynamic of comic books often leading the way in these conversations. It's why the Comics Code Authority was such an issue for several independent comic creators, and why when Vertigo and some of these other comics started being published without the Comics Code, that it was a big deal. I may be getting my timing off wrong for to some extent. I remember the Comics Code was something that died a death in the '80s, really, but then it lingered on for a while, more symbolic than anything else before people finally just walked away from it. And it was kind of a big deal for comic publishers at the time to walk away from the Comics Code, because it was seen as a break from the norm. And this is probably worth its own video. But when comics did stop putting it on there, there were kind of, I want to say dire predictions, but there were conversations about how comics were going yellow and commie because they weren't going to have the Comics Code, which was seen as a way to kind of protect children and American values and so on. This was a thing that people were debating and going back and forth on. It's kind of hard to think about now. At any rate, uh, it's true that comics has often led the conversation in certain cases, and there's two kind of very pragmatic reasons why that is. The first is just fundamentally it didn't have the same kind of attention and distribution. And when we say led the conversation, quote unquote, we're talking primarily more with indie type comics, things like Vertigo, things like some of these comics that were not mainstream Marvel. Although in the '70s, I mean, you did have Marvel comics and DC comics tackling substance abuse and some of these other kind of more and I don't want to say adult topics, but things that were maybe a little bit more visceral, a little bit more uh, you know graphical than what you were seeing in other places. Other places being other magazines, other periodicals, where things were taken a little bit safer, if you will. I'm not sure that's the perfect word to describe it, but it's fair enough. Um, and but to be fair, it's not like Sandman and Preacher were handling the same topics that say Spider-Man and the Hulk were. There was gradation, but it is true that Spider-Man and Green Arrow and comics like that were handling more serious topics in the '70s and '80s that were not being handled by, say, A Boy's Life. And part of that is just nature of the book. Part of it is the fact that Boy's Life was aimed at younger boys, and Spider-Man, while it's true, is a comic book, and many people viewed it as aimed for kids. It knew its readership was more adult than, say, Boy's Life, or I'm trying to think. I'm trying to go back in my memory. What are the magazines? If you grew up in the '70s or the '80s, there are all these magazines kind of aimed at kids. Like Parade, I think, was one of them. A lot of these are terrible. Like, the only place I would see these was at the dentist's office, and I'm like, get some comic books in here. I remember going to the dentist. It's like what made the dentist's office all more crappy is like you're sitting there and you're about to have something terrible happen to you, and meanwhile the magazines they have are like Women's Day and Parade, and like these terrible kid based magazines are both unfunny and awful, and you're like, The least they could do when I'm about to have like get shots in my mouth, the least they could do is like put some Batman in here. I mean, seriously. Anyway, um, but I think some people have kind of magnified that time in history, or that way comics are, to say that comic books have a responsibility to tell a certain type of story, and that's always where I get a little bit. I don't like that idea of this commercial product, this thing that is out to make money, that is designed to attract an audience, generate an audience, spin it around into cash, that there's a responsibility for it to do anything. To me, it's like saying, going to the grocery store and buying fajitas. There's a responsibility for the fajitas to be culturally aware. The responsibility of the fajitas is to be my dinner. It's not meant to be anything but food. And so with comics, it's like, if the creator wants to, as I've done videos in the past, if the creator wants to and is capable of telling a story that makes you think, and can touch on some of these cultural ideas and moments, then more power to them. But I don't think the comic needs to show up at the door and, like, be able to handle nuanced aspects of racism. I think that's setting too high of an expectation around what comics are. Comics are there to make money. They're there to get lots of people to read them, and primarily with the broadest audience possible, so it can bring in cash. That's the goal. But I think that I do agree. On one hand, I'm flopping back and forth all over this issue, but it's not a flip flop. I just think it's not something you post an easy label on. I do think that comic books, because they're visual, so you can get expressions and you can get kind of a lot of visual nuance to the story, and you've got thought bubbles and text bubbles, and you've got an ongoing character and history behind these comics. I think that there's it's a good vehicle to tell tougher topics. When I say tougher, I mean things that maybe aren't explained as well on TV, where you've got or movies where you got moving pictures, you don't have access to the thoughts, or if you do, you have to you don't have the same kind of visual moment. Where in comics, I'll give you a perfect example. Um, Comics has both fluid and still storytelling. And what I mean by that is that you can read a page and it's got 6 panels on it. Your eye can travel from panel to panel to panel. You can see movement. You can see, here are the New Mutants in this panel, and they're rushing into the building, and then now we're going to stop, and Sam's going to have a thought, and then Danny's going to respond, and then they're rushing into the building again, and now they're getting jumped by a villain. Okay, so you got this point A to point B of things going on with some movement and some dialogue and maybe some thinking, and that's the page. And with movies, you have the same thing. You can watch a movie and you watch a scene from point A to point B, but you don't. In comics, if you want to convey in a panel that, say, Sam is worried about something or he's conflicted about something, the panel might have him kind of worrying and thinking. And for the reader, the person who's picking up the comic and reading it, they will move from panel to panel at their own pace. And what you will notice is there's two things that happen when you read a comic page. One is just your eyes reading the words and however long it takes you to read. That's one bit of time. The second is that you will naturally stop or pause or linger on a panel to take in what is being conveyed there, whether it's an expression or whether it's a detailed part of the panel, or there's something different going on in the foreground or the background. You will move along that page at your own pace, and your own pace will vary wildly. So, you'll spend less time on a splash page, more time on a certain panel. That's just kind of how it's going to go. And where TV and movies are concerned, when you're watching something, they're in control of that pace. They're going to move you along at the moments they want. And even if you want to, say, pause the movie, you can do that, but you're kind of quickly freezing a moment in time, and then you're resuming at the same pace again. You don't have that same narrative, that same ability to kind of control what's happening yourself. And why do I go into this in context of this video? Because what you're doing there is what, by you having that ability, it gives the storyteller, crafted storytellers, craftsman, good storyteller, whatever, good storytellers. It gives good storytellers the ability to tell a more layered, more complex story. So if you're tackling a topic like jealousy or rage or emotions or racism or any kind of more complex, emotional, deeper type topic, you have some additional tools at your disposal that movies and TV do not have. Now, movies and TV have other tools. They have visual effects and other things they can do, but visual effects don't necessarily always, cater to emotion. When Schindler's List came out, there was a scene, there was a effect they used where the movie's in black and white, and then in a couple scenes they colored part of the scene. And one reason they did that is it meant to evoke tragedy because they drew your eye to a part of the screen that was a red dress, and then later we see the red dress, and basically the little girl, I think, has died in this red dress. So it reminds you, your eye remembers the red, so it draws out that here's something special they were wanting to hook into, and then they do the emotional pull of that character is dead later. And comics can do that naturally in every panel and always that. Movies, it's more, it was a rare thing at the time people talked about. So that's where I do think there's an argument to be made that comics have not a responsibility, but a capability of telling some of these stories better. And again, it takes a very good writer, good artist, good creative team to actually pull this off. But comics have some natural abilities to tell a deeper, more thought-provoking story. One thing I want to interject here is a lot of people say, comics have a responsibility to tell, to focus on these social issues. And I hate that term. I hate everything about that sentence because I, again, don't think it's a responsibility. I don't think social issues are the be all end all of anything. And I think that's actually taking a fraction of the storytelling tools you have rather than simply saying a more honest statement would be comics have the capability of telling complex stories, telling thought-provoking narratives, telling unique unique stories. I think that's what it is. And so I think if you're going to say, well, comics have a responsibility to tell stories about social equality, sure, that's one aspect of thought-provoking. But I think there's lots of thought-provoking. I mean, I think comics have a unique ability to address things like jealousy and death and murder and loss and tragedy. I think comics have a great way of doing that and a lot of tools that they can do that in a really, really effective way. Still don't think they have a responsibility to do that beyond just telling good stories. I think they have a responsibility to tell good stories, especially if they're going to charge $5 an issue for it. They have a responsibility to tell good stories, and they have a capability. I'm just kidding. You get the idea. I'm just repeating myself at this point. I think comics have a lot of great tools at their disposal, more so than movies and TV. And I think with great power comes great responsibility. I think because they have this ability, I do think there's a certain level of they should live up to that. But I don't think comics should ever feel forced or that comics have to tell these kinds of stories. Sometimes comics should be Michael Bay movies. They should just be popcorn flicks doing their thing, entertaining and not worrying about telling any kind of deeper story. But when they're able to, and when the writer has a deeper story in mind that he or she can tell, they should do it. I think that's great too. Anyway, that's what I think about the topic. I hope some of this was valuable. There are some things in here I tried to put across, maybe some new concepts that we don't often think about where comics are concerned around how you read them, how you consume them, how stories can be told. So I don't know, it was interesting for me to talk about it. I hope it was interesting for you to listen to it. If it was, hey, give me a like, subscribe to the video, leave a comment below. What do you think about all this? What's your feeling on it, and how do you approach all this stuff? How do you take it? Would love to hear your thoughts. Otherwise, follow me on Twitter at Comic Perch. Leave me a note, ask me a question. Always happy to get it. Thanks for listening.